where there is a likelihood of a nuclear exchange breaking out, this part of the world is obviously the most serious one, much more so than for Northeast Asia, Korea, or even the Middle East, where it's Israel that have nuclear weapons. Why? Well, obviously because this is the only part of the world where, since the formation of the two countries, India and Pakistan, you've had a continuous hot-cold war, which shows absolutely no signs of abating. Why is this significant? Because the likelihood of a nuclear exchange really emerges in the context in which there can be a conventional outbreak, which then sets in motion, or which can then set in motion what can be called an escalation dynamic, whereby two sides start off by not wanting to use their nuclear weapons, reach a position where they have to start considering the use of nuclear weapons because they are fearful that the other side might actually do so. And incidentally, this is exactly what happened in 1999, 1 year after 1998 tests by both these countries, when you had Kargil, and when both sides actually had to prepare their nuclear weapons for possible use. Fortunately, at that time, tensions subsided, largely because of external intervention, but that's an indication of that. Another indication, Operation Pokharan, after the assault on the Parliament in December 2001, the Indian Parliament, you had a million troops on each side of the border facing each other, which incidentally, since the Second World War, is the longest period in which two countries in peacetime have mobilized such a large number of troops vis-a-vis each other. And again, it took external intervention after some 7-8 months to actually, was it 9 months, to actually ease tensions and to carry out a demobilization on both sides. So that's an indication of the kind of problems here. And from time to time, tensions exist. The other fact, of course, is that 1999 Kargil angered the Indian foreign policy establishment, in the sense that they felt that Pakistan made a conventional attack on India behind its nuclear shield. And George Fernandez at that time, who was the defense minister, warned that we can't allow Pakistan to get away with this. In other words, they shouldn't think that because they've got nuclear weapons that we would be afraid to attack them conventionally. And you had what was the development subsequently of what is called the Cold Start Doctrine, in which the Indian government, although it formally denies it, but everybody knows that it's there, has indicated that it would not hesitate to attack Pakistan in Pakistani territory if it came to that. And to which, of course, the Pakistanis have responded by drawing certain red lines and have developed battlefield nuclear weapons, indicating that if the Indian troops do come into Pakistani territory, they would definitely consider, if they go up beyond a certain point, and they've drawn certain red lines, which one can elaborate on, they would use nuclear weapons on Pakistani territory. And which I can assure you that if that happens, using battlefield nuclear weapons on Indian troops in Pakistani territory, don't think that the Indians will not retaliate with nuclear weapons. So these are the kind of tensions that exist, these are the kind of problems. One can go on, there's an escalating arms race which is not even under the control of these two governments. All of these really create a lot of worry and concern sometime in the future. And incidentally, recent research has shown that even a small nuclear exchange would unleash a nuclear winter, which would have effects, of course, which are at the moment incalculable, but certainly beyond the South Asian region itself.
Recently, the government experts have called for a revision of India's nuclear posture, including the no first use and the so-called minimum credible deterrence. So how do you think it will affect peace in South
Well,
Asia?
during the 2014 general election campaign, you had the BJP saying that they would consider reviewing that. They have not done that so far. But the no first use perspective of doctrine of the Indian government is in any case weak. It's one thing to declare no first use, okay. It's another thing to carry out preparations which are not in accordance with that. The no first use doctrine basically means that you would only want to have a certain amount of nuclear weapons to attack the population centers of the other side. You do not go ahead to develop tactical nuclear weapons. You keep a certain low threshold or low arsenal, enough to hit the cities of the other side and so on. But of course, the arms race that is taking place in India betrays that. It's not just that the Pakistanis have gone in for tactical nuclear weapons, the Indians have gone in. The Indians have gone in for cruise missiles, right, which can go under the radar and which can also carry, which is a first strike weapon aimed at military targets. It's not necessary to have cruise missiles if all you want is to attack the population centers. Right? Besides this, of course, the Indian no first use is inferior. Apart from the fact that the practical preparations are not in accordance with no first use. That's also the case with the Chinese. But even at the declaratory level, the Chinese no first use is superior to that, because the Indians add qualification. A no first use is supposed to be accompanied by a no use. That is to say, no first use against nuclear weapons powers and no use against non-nuclear powers. That goes along with the no first use doctrine. The Chinese have a categorical no use against non-nuclear weapons, non-nuclear weapon states. The Indians qualify this in two ways. One, they say if a non-nuclear weapon state has biological or chemical weapons, they can consider using nuclear weapons. Secondly, if a non-nuclear weapon state has an alliance with a nuclear weapon state, they could consider using it. The Chinese no first use and no use doctrine is in fact better than that. But what's very interesting is that you never hear about this in the Indian media or from the lips of the nuclear strategic establishment. They just want to promote this myth about India being a much more responsible nuclear state. It's the Chinese and the Pakistanis are bad. They keep quiet, of course, about the Americans because they have an alliance with the United States of America. So they do not wish to inform the Indian public that their no first use and no use doctrine is in fact inferior to that of the Chinese, because that would go against this kind of image that they want to present about themselves.
So in this context, what is your prescription for nuclear disarmament?
What are my prescription? A number of things. For example, you also mentioned this question of a stable deterrent. You can't have a stable nuclear deterrent because it keeps on escalating. The side that strikes first and can attack the other side's military targets always has a certain advantage. Therefore, the other side wants to have a substantial second strike capacity. But by developing a second strike capacity which can also be used in the first strike, because of course delivery vehicles are getting much more accurate these days, precision guided munitions and so on. The other side then says, well, they could use it first, even though they're saying that they're using it for a second strike. So we will have to develop ours. And so it carries on. The situation in South Asia is made worse by the fact that the Americans are developing a ballistic missile defense system and a theater missile defense system against the Russians and the Chinese, forcing the Russians and the Chinese to also enhance their nuclear arsenal in a variety of ways, merving it, having more warheads on one missile, having bigger bombs so that if they get through the missile shield, they can do more damage and so on. And that of course means that since the Chinese are trying to overload the American ballistic missile defense preparations, the Indians have to consider the fact that the Chinese might use it against them. That's the way they think, and therefore they're going to produce more nuclear weapons, which means that the Pakistanis, in other words, there's a dimension of the nuclear arms race between India and Pakistan, which is not even under the control of either of these countries. So these are all examples of the kind of mess and this ridiculous arms race that's going on, which makes a mockery of the notion of a credible second strike capacity, stable deterrence. In other words, minimum credible deterrence is a constantly moving position, upwards moving. And that's in reality what's happening. So that, given the situation, what are the kind of things we were asked about, what could be done at the disarmament level? Well, India and China should come together. India should first of all unilaterally improve its no first doctrine. India and China can come together to make a joint declaration calling on the other nuclear weapon states to also have a no first use, which India, that's one thing. The Pakistanis have suggested over time and again that they are prepared for a no war pact, to which the Indians respond saying, look, we have a no first use, you should have a no first use. Right? So why not link the two together? And that say that, okay, simultaneously we'll have a no war pact, and India will agree to a no war pact, and Pakistan can do that, can also have a no first use. These are nuclear restraint measures. These are confidence building measures. There are other things that will also be done. There's of course a momentum and a movement towards outlawing nuclear weapons because of their terrible humanitarian consequences. The logic behind this is that in order to first get rid of something, you should make it illegal. You have to, if you like, outlaw slavery, and that helps in the struggle to eliminate slavery. By doing this, you would also be arguing that countries that do not support this ban, there would be some nuclear weapon states, are basically acting in a criminal behavior. So that also has a public impact and so on. It's noticeable that for all the talk from the Indian nuclear establishment that they want to move towards global nuclear disarmament, they are very, very reluctant to move in this direction. Otherwise, they want to pretend all the time that they are responsible nuclear weapon states, they believe in nuclear disarmament, but when it comes down to taking practical steps, they don't want to do that. I'll give you another example on a regional level, and that is, why not declare both sides of the border with regard to Kashmir, declare the whole of Kashmir as a nuclear weapons free zone. It has no practical impact on India and Pakistan because neither country stations nuclear weapons in their part of Kashmir, but it would have an important political impact because both the Indian government and the Pakistani government and their nuclear elites keep on moaning from time to time about, why do other countries think that we are more prone to using nuclear weapons, this is racist, blah blah, the usual stuff. Of course, other countries recognize that because of this tension between India and Pakistan, whose main cause is Kashmir, right, there is a danger here. Well, then you can actually, by declaring Kashmir on both sides to be nuclear weapons free zone, you are actually giving a response to your critics, which is to say that even if there was a conflict over Kashmir, it's not going to escalate towards that. It's a significant gesture that you could make, and it has no practical impact in preventing you from deploying because you're not deploying. But will the Indian government do this even if it makes sense? Here, or the Pakistani government? Well, the Pakistanis might if the Indians would agree. Incidentally, there is one political party on the Pakistan side of the border in Kashmir which has actually called for this. I think they recognize the merit of this after the CNDP some time ago raised this perspective. The Indians are hesitant to do this because that would be the thin end of the wedge. It would legitimize the idea of a nuclear weapons free zone. And here, of course, the Indian government, the Pakistani government, let Pakistani anti-nuclears talk about that. Of course, they're hypocritical. I want to point out the hypocrisy of the Indian government. The Indian government wants to sign the existing nuclear weapons free zones as the protocols for that as a nuclear weapon state because that would help to legitimize it. But when it comes to a nuclear weapons free zone in this part of the world or even a small one in Kashmir, they don't want to do that. Incidentally, the one country which has officially called for a South Asian nuclear weapons free zone to the dislike of India and Pakistan is Bangladesh. The former Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh had in fact said that there should be a South Asian nuclear weapons free zone because obviously if there is a nuclear exchange, it's not just going to restrict itself in its damage to India or Pakistan. But all the countries that are part of the CD, the Conference on Disarmament, have to agree. And there's a lot of criticism of Pakistan because Pakistan is saying, no, we must bring in stocks, not just the stockpiles of fissile materials. Now this is important because except for India and Pakistan, China, Russia, the United States, Britain, France, they have got enough fissile materials. So they are quite happy if there's simply a cut-off in production, because it doesn't really affect them. Even as you've had the reduction of, say, the number of warheads deployed by the Russians and the Americans, all it means is that the fissile materials in those warheads has added to the existing stock. So they have more than enough. They don't need to produce more. So in other words, the fissile material cut-off treaty is no big deal. The Indian belief is that it will take some years before this comes into play, and by that time they will have enough stockpile. And incidentally, they do have enough considerable stockpile of both fissile materials and reactor grade as well as weapons grade fissile material. They already have much more than Pakistan. So Pakistan's point about addressing stocks is very, very important. The counter argument to that is that don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Let's at least have a production cutoff. To which the response of many anti-nuclear groups and others is a very sensible one. They said, okay, if you don't want to accept the Pakistanis, don't keep on making out the Pakistanis to be the baddies and the others being the goodies, right? Then let's do something else. Let's have a compromise in which we will not insist on the elimination of stockpiles or a process of elimination of stockpiles, but what we will insist is that, okay, let's have a fissile material production cut-off treaty. Alongside of that, let all the stockpiles be at least publicly monitored and controlled. Even if you retain them nationally, there should be access for international inspection so that there's nothing here. So at least there's some control that they will not be used or misused in any way. And that would be an important step forward. There's already, as you know, a model nuclear weapons convention. And the process of negotiation on that should start. Should the non-nuclear weapon states carry on a process of negotiation regardless of the fact that the nuclear weapon states are not going to join it? That at least puts some kind of international public pressure. It's a kind of replay, if you like, of the Ottawa Convention on the Landmines Treaty. At first, the negotiations began on that, and by doing that, you put pressure. That too is something that one can consider. The extension of nuclear weapons-free zones is another one. I have argued that Nepal should think of establishing itself as a single-state nuclear weapons free zone in the same way that Mongolia has done. Because if you declare yourself a single state, that means you can call on the nuclear weapon states to sign the protocols respecting that. The Indians want to sign it for others because that would legitimize them. But would the Indians and Pakistanis be prepared to sign that if the Nepal went ahead to do that? So that's something that I've suggested, that a number of organizations in the anti-nuclear movement should try to put pressure on Nepal to move. In fact, a number of political parties in Nepal were quite keen on this. But of course, the behind-the-scenes pressure from the Indian government in particular against this acts against. But if they get international support, that's another thing. Bangladesh can call for a stretching of the Bangkok Treaty to include this. These are ways of politically, if you like, giving a slap in the face to India and Pakistan politically about their having nuclear weapons. One can talk about a global register for plutonium and uranium enrichment stocks, so that at least we have information about that and we have a register. So these are all things that can be done. And in order to put pressure on the United States of America to play a role, because obviously as the biggest crook among all these crooks, nuclear crooks, how do we put pressure on the United States? And here I suspect that you cannot really separate the question of anti-nuclear and nuclear disarmament from the question of anti-militarism and opposition to the United States foreign policy, because nuclear weapons are the most powerful military weapons. And if they are the most powerful military weapons, but nonetheless you can oppose the militarism of the United States, and with some degree of success they have not succeeded, then in fact by opposing them and succeeding in preventing them, you raise the question of how nuclear weapons as the most extreme form of military weapons is in fact pretty useless these days in terms of addressing of even being able to win wars, even being able to, in other words, you put pressure on the United States foreign policy, and its foreign policy, in spite of its having nuclear weapons, is pretty much of a mess. Look at the mess that they have created in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So for all their military might, they've only created huge problems, and I'm therefore suggesting that the anti-nuclear movement in the United States and elsewhere should actually connect to the anti-militarism and anti-US imperialist behavior. Similarly, an anti-nuclear movement in India and all must also take up the question of the Indian attempt to become a kind of regional imperial power in Pakistan, to criticize the Pakistani foreign policy also. I don't think you can separate these two. I wouldn't be in favor of, in fact, connecting.